The Ukrainian war continues to affect the basic policies of the countries of the world on international politics and military balance. The most powerful factor shaping these policies is the USA, one of Ukraine's most important allies. You know that the US administration is now fighting not only against the threat of Russia, but also against the expansionist policies of China, which is trying to blockade Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific maritime areas. In this complex cycle, the USA, Russia, and China mutually carried out many military activities in the sea areas, in areas such as the Sea of Japan, the Pacific, and the Arctic Ocean. Russia tried to take Ukraine's invasion plans to global dimensions in the Indo-Pacific by disturbing Taiwan. China showed its support for Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. Against all this, the USA carried out deterrent military naval exercises in the strategic sea areas we mentioned in order to prevent both countries from creating a new global crisis. Despite the US's efforts to prevent it, China continues its policies of supporting Russia in the Ukraine war. While the last move of the Biden administration caused the Beijing administration to take a step back, the Biden administration has directly warned China not to provide military aid to Russia. This striking step went down in history as the clearest warning of the USA to China. After little more than a year of careful and repeated consideration, China weighed the costs and benefits and bowed to the U.S. threat. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang, at a press conference with German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, who visited Germany, stated that China has adopted a prudent and responsible stance on the export of military product and that the Beijing administration will no longer supply weapons to the relevant parties of the Ukrainian conflict. In addition, Xinjiang added that he will manage the export of dual-use products in accordance with laws and regulations. After critical statements, this was described to the world media as a successful example of the US's use of coercive diplomacy to deter China from providing military aid to Russia. In other words, Russian leader Putin has now lost his most trusted ally. In fact, we have been communicating this to you from the very beginning. The alliance between Russia and China was entirely by a thread. It was obvious for a long time that the solidarity of these two countries was based on a relationship of interest. The whole world faced this reality with the warning of the USA to China. In fact, the U.S. first warning came during a meeting of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in March 2022 with Yang Jiechi, the then director of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Foreign Relations Commission. Just a few months after this warning, Blinken repeated it at the 2023 Munich Security Conference. A senior State Department official who was aware of the actual conversation said that Blinken had given a rather blunt warning about the implications and consequences of China's financial support to Russia. Similarly, the reading of Blinken's September 2022 meeting showed Wang conveying to Wang that the United States is open to cooperation with the PRC where interests intersect. In short, Washington's consistent warnings to Beijing seem to have worked. Will China stick to this policy before addressing this? It is worth mentioning two preliminary observations. First, no embargo lasts forever, so Chinese technology on the battlefield would eventually materialize no matter what. Indeed, declassified information released by the Biden administration in late February 2023 indicated that China's dual-use navigation, radar drone, and electronic communications jamming equipment had reached the Russian military. But right now, China's move away from Russia and its declaration that it will no longer support Moscow for the Ukraine war has changed the balance. Second, China had reasons to provide military aid. In Beijing's eyes, it had saved $35.8 billion in security aid to Ukraine's war effort against Russia, according to the US's own State Department figures. In such a clash, China also wanted to seize this opportunity, but the warnings of the USA did not allow China to enter the Russian market. However, as sympathetic as Beijing may be to Moscow, Qin Gang's statement highlights that China has even more compelling reasons to exercise restraint. Accordingly, Beijing will not provide the necessary military assistance to Moscow to turn the tide of the war. unless the very survival of the Putin regime is at stake. In general, China's policy is determined by a political logic. Therefore, China's restriction created by the warnings of the USA will probably continue. There are three specific political reasons for this. First, Beijing understands both the dangers of an escalation of the war in Ukraine and the risk of Chinese entanglement. Chinese policymakers avoid engaging in a conflict that would anger the West and harm China's own national interests. Also, China is now recognizing the importance of balancing the conflicting imperatives of helping Russia. Also, Russia's military performance in Ukraine has generated highly critical internal commentary in China's strategic studies community. Chinese strategists understand that in order to change the military outcome in Ukraine in favor of Moscow, a politically untenable level of military support should not be provided. Second, decisive military assistance to Russia will inevitably trigger economic sanctions from Brussels and Washington, jeopardizing China's economic growth prospects. The CCP's domestic political legitimacy is based on its ability to provide a sustained return to strong economic growth, which itself will also be based on continued trade with the EU and the US, especially in the post-coronavirus pandemic era. The EU and the US became the two largest trading partners, representing 13.7% and 12.5% respectively of China's trade in 2021. However, there is much more to the trade volume. European technology is becoming more and more critical to the quality of China's economic development, so Beijing relies on Europe as a reliable source of alternative technology. This fact promoted Wang Yi to the post of director of the CCP Central Committee on Foreign Relations in January 2023. According to Wang, what efforts should be made to stop the war must be adjusted to European interests. So Putin has already been eliminated by China for economic reasons. Thirdly, and lastly, China seems intent on projecting a more positive image of itself in world politics, especially after the coronavirus pandemic. In February this year, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs published two important documents. The first was a systematic critique of U.S. hegemony, emphasizing the claim that Washington abused its power to maximize its political, military, economic, technological, and cultural interests. The latter was more positive, outlining Beijing's global security initiative, a Chinese alternative to the U.S. model of world politics. In the current situation, China's decision to provide military support to Russia will undermine the GSI, causing many states to see Beijing as a facilitator of hegemonic behavior that criticized the U.S. Therefore, China had to step back. As a result, the U.S. policy of deterrence was successful in China's military assistance to Russia. Beijing will maintain diplomatic and economic support to Russia, but will try to limit military support. The reasons for the continuation of this policy reflect a combination of factors. The dangers of China's military allegiance to Russia are a cause for concern that military aid to Russia will trigger economic sanctions from Brussels and Washington, and given China's imperative to improve its international image, the U.S. did a good job by openly warning China, except in the unlikely scenario of Putin's fall, Beijing will not provide Moscow with the military capabilities it needs. Apparently, Russia has to make do with what it has. The mother of all metaphorical storms has hit Russia's attack boats in the Black Sea and key waters over the past few weeks. Massive waves upset Moscow's military and economic interests. It smashed the bargaining chip and undermined its diplomatic position on the world stage. Dozens of Russian warships and battle boats have so far been destroyed by the Ukrainian Navy and artillery in the Black Sea and the Dnipro River. While Russia's loss of important warships hits Putin like a hammer blow, the heart of the war continues to beat in strategic water bodies. Let's see how the Ukrainian troops buried the Russian assault boats in the depths of the Dnipro waters. 9 years after Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, Kiev is making a name for itself with a bold naval offensive that heralds a new era in naval warfare. In an unexpected move, Ukrainian artillery launched attacks targeting Russian attack boats stationed on the Dnipro River in recent weeks. Nearly a dozen Russian warboats have sunk into the deep waters of the river with successful artillery fire. With the Ukrainian artillery and rocket units virtually besieging Dnipro, the Russians began to look for exit routes in the river with their attack boats. But the striking operations of the Ukrainian armed forces continue at full speed. As a result of the offensive operations launched by the Ukrainian forces, the Russian assault boat was destroyed at the mouth of the Dnipro River. The destruction of 2 Russian attack boats in this offensive operation limited the reconnaissance and sabotage actions of the Russians in Dnipro. Ukrainian troops, which dealt a heavy blow to Russia's reconnaissance actions, continued to advance on the front lines without stopping. Ukrainian defense forces succeeded in sinking another Russian boat near Belarusi Island in Dnipro. Russian warboats and assault boats were unable to escape from the Ukrainian artillery. Ukraine has already eliminated 3 Russian warships with successful artillery fire. Of course, the losses of the Russian troops were not limited to these. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, we talked about the presence of Ukrainian artillery units in the Dnipro River. The Ukrainian River Fleet and the artillery of the Southern Command had sworn to put an end to the Russian boat. Ukrainian forces destroyed 5 more Russian attack boats carrying Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups last week. The Russian troops were forced to take a defensive position in Dnipro as they were shaken by the losses of their warboats. The Ukrainian artillery ravaged the Dnipro, inflicting heavy losses on the Russian army within 2 weeks. The Russians lost 8 battle assault boats in just 2 weeks. As is known for centuries, Moscow saw the Black Sea as its gateway to the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, a strategic inland waterway that attracted fierce rivalries between coastal kingdoms and empires. President Vladimir Putin had calculated that the invasion of Ukraine would make it easier for the powerful Russian Navy to reach the Black Sea. But Putin probably hadn't envisioned the possibility that the loss of warships would humiliate Moscow on the world stage, frustrating its maritime ambitions. In addition, the Ukrainian offensive attacks which prevented the Russian army from achieving success at sea are in fact important steps in the implementation of the Ukrainian armed forces' main goal, which is the capture of the Crimean Peninsula. In particular, taking the Dnipro region under control is important in terms of retargeting Crimea. The road to victory for Ukraine passes through the Crimea. Therefore, the liberation of Crimea this year could change everything in this war. Ukraine has been making efforts for a long time to realize the Crimea goal. Things started to move faster as Kiev launched counterattacks, especially in the south. As part of this shift in momentum, Ukraine adopted a bold strategy to harass Russian naval assets. From July 2022, Ukraine began to carry out attacks on the headquarters of the Russian Navy in Sevastopol on the Crimean Peninsula. These attacks were carried out using air and waterborne drones. Regular attacks by Ukrainian forces underline the insecurity of the Russian Navy. It is difficult to predict how much the activities in the seas will be affected by the loss of Russia's warboats. We will wait and see this together. In the war between Russia and Ukraine, the Black Sea is the scene of very important strategic clashes. The Black Sea, which had been under the domination of the Russian Navy for a long time, was the scene of Ukraine's challenge. It has also been a rare point of agreement between the two countries. The Russian invasion of Ukraine took place mostly in a series of difficult ground battles. But for the governments in Kiev and Moscow, the Black Sea was also a vital stage in the war. In recent months, Russian warships have launched a series of cruise missiles at Ukrainian targets, sometimes hundreds of miles away, hitting towns and cities and damaging the country's energy infrastructure. Ukrainian authorities regularly warn residents of possible attacks when they detect missile ships in the Black Sea. The Ukrainian military has made it a strategic priority to penetrate Moscow's air of naval superiority with a series of daring attacks. But the importance of the Black Sea, which U.S. officials say an American drone crashed the other day after being taunted by a Russian warplane, extends beyond military conflict to the geopolitical and economic interests of Ukraine and Russia. The Black Sea borders both countries as well as Georgia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, and is a very important link between its ports and the Mediterranean. The trade route was so critical for both countries that it became a rare point of agreement during the war. An agreement brokered by Turkey and the United Nations last July allowed Russia to send its own shipments of food and fertilizer while creating a corridor for ships carrying grain and other food crops to leave Ukrainian ports and pass through the Russian blockade. The Moscow Navy dominated the Black Sea for years, and Russia legally annexed the Crimean Peninsula partly because the city of Sevastopol had been the main port of the Black Sea Fleet for centuries. And since last February, Russia has deployed its navy off the coast of Ukraine, effectively blocking Ukraine's ships in the port, even as Russia controlled the waters of the Black Sea. It was the scene of Ukraine's challenge last February. Ukrainian fighters stationed on Snake Island, a land mass off the coast of Odessa, refused to surrender to a Russian naval ship seeking control. That event symbolized Ukraine's resistance. Russian forces later captured the island but were forced to retreat following Ukrainian missile attacks in June. Some of Ukraine's most notable attacks have also come to the Black Sea. Ukraine's missile attack sank Moscow, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, in April. And in October, the Kerch Strait bridge connecting Crimea to Russia was severely damaged by an explosion. The bridge boom made it difficult for Moscow to supply its forces in Crimea and also embarrassed Russian President Vladimir Putin, who personally took part in the bridge's construction. In short, the Black Sea plays a very important role in the Ukrainian war with its geostrategic importance. How do you think the developments in this water body will affect the war in the coming days? We would be happy if you let us know your thoughts in the comments. As a result, Russia's approach to the Black Sea is based on a centuries-old history of conflict with the great powers of Europe and Russia's long geopolitical rivalry with Turkey. Its objectives include fending off any threat from NATO to Russia's heartland or its strategic stronghold in Crimea more generally. Moscow sees the Black Sea region as vital to its geo-economic strategy, such as reflecting Russian power and influence in the Mediterranean, maintaining economic and trade links with key European markets, and making southern Europe more dependent on Russian oil and gas. Moscow is dependent on the Black Sea for both military operations outside its immediate vicinity and access to the Mediterranean and beyond for the export of Russia's main commodity. For Moscow, the security of the Russian homeland and its ability to project power are above all other considerations. However, Russia also has important economic assets in the Black Sea region that it wants to protect. The Black Sea is an important trade and transportation artery for Russia. If the Ukraine war continues, Russia's presence in the Black Sea will take serious damage. The destruction of Russian Navy boats by Ukraine will put Putin's power in the Black Sea and other important water bodies into question. Even if an important attack to be experienced in the coming days in the Black Sea, the heart of the war affects Ukraine. In particular, its echoes will be heard all over the world. The Russians continued prioritizing their least successful direction and throwing their best forces in an attempt to capture Volodya. Despite successfully rebuffing previous Russian attacks, the Ukrainians have found a way how to destroy Russian attackers even more easily. Because today it was reported that they eliminated a Russian commander in charge of the assault units with the precision strike, which allowed them to destroy the disorganized troops on the ground much faster. Last time I told you that the Russians attempted to penetrate the front line west of Ul-Ada in order to create a bulge, stretch Ukrainian reserves and diminish the supply and support of Ul-Ada. As you remember, the Ukrainians met the attackers with fire and prevented them from establishing control over the hills. But as it turned out, the Ukrainians did not stop there. Today, Russian commander of the forces located in this region reported that the Ukrainians immediately launched a counterattack. Some sources indicate that as a result of this counterattack, the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back to their initial positions across the river. After that, some Russian sources said that several Ukrainian groups were spotted between Prekastinka and Pavlivka. They concluded that the Ukrainians were preparing to further penetrate Russian defenses and that the Russians prudently scared them off with artillery. However, today's report about the successful Ukrainian on the Russian command post of the East Battalion strongly indicates that the Russians were not planning an attack. They were just sending reconnaissance groups into the Russian territory while the Ukrainians were conducting this reconnaissance mission. The Russians launched yet another assault in the direction of the hamlet east of Volodar. But because the Ukrainian HIMARS strike on the Russian headquarters killed the headquarters commander, the coordination of Russian forces was undermined and the Ukrainians quickly repelled the Russian attack. Another Russian commander said that it was a smart move on the part of the Ukrainians because if he destroyed the army headquarters, the battle will continue. But if he destroyed the battalion headquarters, the battle will quickly die out because battalion headquarters are most involved in the process of managing and collecting and analyzing what is happening on the ground. All other headquarters build their understanding of the current situation mainly from the battalion level reports. He added that they were ready for such developments and had prepared alternative ways. But as many speculate, this was likely added to avoid problems with the higher command. The most recent updates indicate that the Russians became quieter, which suggests that their further attacks were either put on hold or cancelled. This is not the first commander that the Russians have lost here. Around a week ago, in one of the disastrous Russian attacks, the Russians lost a colonel who was in charge of the whole brigade. The fact that the Russians continue committing significant amounts of resources to the border area despite high losses clearly signals that taking bolder is imperative for achieving broader goals. Furthermore, recently published geolocated footage showed the aftermath of a Russian thermobaric artillery strike near Volodarka. As noted by the Institute for the Study of War, thermobaric artillery systems are military district-level assets which suggest that Russian forces put a high priority on Volodar. Thermobaric artillery is a devastating weapon, but its main shortcoming is that its range only 4 kilometers, making it an easy target. The Ukrainians are hunting down these artillery systems, so the Russians usually need them as a lost cause. The fact that the Russians are continuously engaged in them despite very effective counter battery fire once again emphasizes the importance of Volodar in order to take advantage of the opportunity to destroy this rare Russian artillery systems. The Ukrainians have relocated to the Volodar area, another artillery brigade, and now Volodar should have as much artillery support as Bakhmut. Overall, the Russians are spending their resources at a much faster rate than previously, which signals the urgent need for the success of operational significance before they can launch an attack of strategic significance. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians continue holding their main strongholds and forcing the Russians to put all their plans on hold by rebuffing their attacks. Recent developments, in particular the death of several commanders responsible for the battalions and brigades, is a much bigger setback because, firstly, they need to cancel their plans and find a replacement, and secondly, the replacements will unlikely be as experienced as previous commanders, which will undermine Russian performance even more.